Okay, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We are on chapter 13, which is entitled E24. When Beaker found out that Larraine had moved into his trailer, he cussed from his hospital bed. Angry but helpless, he fingered the scar from his triple bypass, a 9-inch pink worm that puffed up from the middle of his chest. Larraine was breathing heavily when he got her on the phone. Quote, Beaker, end quote, she said, quote, we're starting out fresh. I'm throwing everything out, end quote. She had spent the morning cleaning the kitchen, tossing the left out black applesauce and fly covered ribs before deciding that everything had to go, even the cans of food, because bugs were crawling on them. Beaker suggested Larraine take the back bedroom, but she refused because it was filthy. She took out her steamer and worked it over the couch. She would sleep on its cushions next to the mound of things she had rescued from her trailer. When Beaker came home from the hospital, he planted himself at the kitchen table and dashed his cigarette into a disposable plastic bowl, the kind you fill with olives at the deli. Beaker's real name was Robert, but everyone called him by his childhood nickname. A brooding and taciturn man with slicked black, sorry about that. It's like a brooding and taciturn man with slicked back black and gray hair. Beaker had retired from driving a city bus a few years back when his health began to deteriorate. Beaker asked Larraine to split the rent, but Larraine said she couldn't because she had to make steady payments to Eagle Moving. They fought, and Beaker settled for Larraine covering the cable and phone bills. Then they fought over what to watch on television. Beaker preferred shows like Ice Road Truckers. Larraine demanded So You Think You Can Dance. Then they fought over Beaker's refusal to share his dinners from Meals on Wheels because he was still miffed that Larraine threw out his canned food. Larraine's food stamps had been cut off, and the turmoil of her eviction, she had forgotten about a meeting at the welfare office. So she began asking neighbors for spare plates and visiting church pantries. During her first visit to Eagle, Larraine gave her name to a black man behind the counter who was wearing a backwards cap and gold crucifix. Quote, and when I pay, can I go look at my stuff? End quote, Larraine asked. Quote, no, this is a bonded storage, ma'am. I can't let you back there. End quote. Rifling through your things and pulling out, say, winter clothing was not allowed. Quote, all right, end quote. Quote, you got the in fee, the out fee, and the first month's storage, end quote, the man said. Quote, that adds up to $375. Then each month after that, it goes up another $125, end quote. The man suggested Larraine try to get her things out soon so she wouldn't have to pay on another month. But having just given him what amounted to over half her SSI check, Larraine knew this was impossible. It would take her several months to save for a new apartment while still paying Beaker and Eagle. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. And again, we just see how many people are profiting off of poverty, how many people are profiting off of exploiting people who are in poverty. And that's only, a lot of these things are only possible because of how many people in our society turn a blind eye to them, or how many people in our society decide that because it doesn't directly affect them, they don't care about the people that are undergoing these things or undergoing these circumstances. And I think that what is important for us to do is to always implore that we are all connected, and what may not affect one of us directly definitely affects us indirectly. Okay, let's continue reading. In the trailer park, Larraine tried to lie low and avoid Lenny and Office Susie. She knew that if they found out where she was staying, they would tell Tobin, who might throw her out, and Beaker along with her. Lenny and Office Susie were crucial to Tobin and to his tenants. They could get you evicted just as easily as they could get your toilet working again. Susie pushed for Pam and Scott to be kicked out, but she would also run down the Cadillac and yell at Tobin if she thought he was overcharging someone or moving too slow fixing a porch railing. Most important, Lenny and Susie were cultural brokers, bridging the gap between Tobin and his tenants and smoothing things over when he crossed the line, like the time he approached the tenants' kids, telling them their father owed rent. On numerous occasions, Lenny literally placed himself between Tobin and an enraged tenant. This was a common practice, outsider landlords hiring people from the community, usually their tenants, to manage property. The kids Tobin had approached about the rent belonged to Donnie, a portly and unshaven man in his mid-30s who was liked by almost everyone in the trailer park. Donnie was already refusing to pay Tobin, not because he didn't have the money, but because he felt disrespected. Let me try that sentence again. Donnie was already refusing to pay Tobin, not because he didn't have the money, but because he felt disrespected. He put his rent in escrow, citing his leaking roof and the black mold under the sink. Said Donnie to his neighbor, Robbie, quote, "You know what he tells me? You rented it as is. Tobin is just too ignorant to know that there are people in here that don't live off Social Security," end quote. Quote, "Damn right," end quote, Robbie spat. Quote, "He asked me if I had a job. I said, motherfucker, I work for the union," end quote. Robbie was a deep tunnel miner and a member of Local 113. Quote, "You gonna treat me like shit? I sure as hell ain't gonna pay you. I don't care who you are. You're not gonna sit there and discriminate me. You know what I mean?" End quote. Quote, "Cause I'm a redneck," end quote. Quote, "Cause you live in a trailer court. Period. You're still a fucking human," end quote. Lenny was a redneck too, and understood where the men were coming from. He agreed that the old man was, quote, "losing it," end quote, but he also pushed back. Quote, "A lot of people say, Tobin, he's an asshole. But why is he the asshole? You're the one who owes him," end quote. What Donnie, Robbie, and the rest of the trailer park didn't know was that Lenny had a financial stake in them paying. Each month, he received a $100 bonus if he collected $50,000. He'd receive an additional $100 for every $2,000 collected after that. Then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. Let's continue reading and then we'll have a reflection. Some days we'll find Lenny walking alongside Roger from the Department of Neighborhood Services, finishing his sentences. Roger, the inspector, glanced down at his clipboard, reviewing notes from his last visit. Quote, "Let's see, W45 was," end quote, quote, "the shed," end quote, Lenny cut in. Quote, "We got it out of here," end quote. Quote, "Ah," end quote. Quote, "Hey, Roger, see anything?" End quote, a tenant called out from his porch. Quote, "Do I see anything?" End quote. Most park residents knew Roger, had his business card tucked away in the kitchen drawer. When they got fed up with some housing problem, they would not threaten to call DNS, but Roger, specifically. A balding white man with a well-trimmed beard, Roger wore a white DNS polo shirt and 3330 Levi's. Quote, "Any violations?" End quote, the tenant clarified, trying to be helpful. Quote, "Well, it's not country living, but if it's habitable inside, it looks good to me." End quote. Quote, "So there aren't any violations." End quote. Roger shrugged and kept walking. Of course there were. He had noticed the pile of trash behind the tenant's trailer and a plywood slab where a window should have been. There were trailers with several cracked windows, large steel barrels used for nighttime fires, and trash floating in standing puddles and overflowing from the two giant dumpsters on either end of the park. Tobin had refused to pay for individual trash cans, but the dumpsters would fill up days before they were emptied, attracting raccoons and possums. One resident had stabbed a possum dead a few nights before Roger's visit. Lenny had shot one once. When the garbage collectors came, residents whose trailers faced the dumpsters would try to convince the truck driver to move them to another spot. They would point to a trailer, saying, sometimes truthfully, quote, "That one's empty," end quote. Roger sighed. Quote, "Man, you gotta keep me from writing up so much shit," end quote. Quote, "Well, don't let that hand go, then," end quote, Lenny replied, telling Roger not to record violations. Quote, "Best of intentions, Lenny, best of intentions. Every time I walk through here, there's always something," end quote. And that was only from the outside. Roger's inspections usually did not take him inside trailers, where you would have seen sunken bathtubs propped up with car jacks or water heaters disconnected from ventilating pipes. Roger stopped in front of a trailer. Quote, "These windows look like they're shot," end quote. Quote, "Well," end quote, Lenny replied. Quote, "They don't have the money to buy new windows, so what do you want me to do? I don't want to buy them for them," end quote. The trailer was owner occupied, meaning its residents were responsible for upkeep. Quote, "I don't want you to have to either," end quote. Quote, "So are we okay?" End quote. Quote, "I'm okay with that," end quote. Back in the office, Roger sighed and lowered his head into his palms. Tobin hung up the phone. Quote, "Okay, what's the matter? What do we got?" End quote. Quote, "Look, if you're going to let trailers that look this bad into your trailer park, you have to make it habitable," end quote. Roger began listing off some of the bigger problems: garbage, open storage sheds, broken windows. Lenny cut in. Quote, "It's been a tough winter," end quote. Quote, "I'm not going to write you up on that," end quote. Roger replied, speaking of the cracked windows. He knew cataloging every code violation was neither feasible nor, he suspected, in the tenants' best interest. Rufus, the junk collector, stepped into the office. Quote, "Are we safe?" End quote, he asked Roger. Although the city had renewed Tobin's license, many tenants still feared removal. Quote, "Yes," end quote, Roger answered. Quote, "Good. Now I don't have to move my giant cat house," end quote. When Rufus's mother died, she owned 72 cats. Rufus was down to 3. And that brings us to a changing of the passage within this chapter. And what stands out to me from what we just read is this paradoxical, I don't know if paradoxical or maybe ironic. And I guess there's some type of irony to an existence of a paradox in itself. But the irony that exists in the fact that the man from Roger, the DNS, correct? DNS. The man from DNS has the authority to force the owner of the trailer park, or the owner of the trailer park in this specific situation, Tobin, to fix some of the problems that exist within the trailer park, to make it more habitable. But also in the midst of doing that, it penalizes the people who live within the trailer park in some ways. We've seen that already, where somebody will call DNS because they're living in a house and they want certain things fixed in the house, and the landlord's not fixing the things. And then when DNS comes, what they do penalize the landlord or the owner of the property for not fixing these things. But in the midst of penalizing them, the person living there also becomes collateral damage, whether it's because they end up having to move out because it's not livable or habitable, and now it's been documented as not being habitable, or because the landlord takes out some type of vendetta against them because they call DNS. And so we see here that there are all types of things in this trailer park that need to be fixed, that need to be addressed. But instead of penalizing Tobin for the existence of these things, in an effort to try to, of course, look out for Tobin and look out for the tenants in a manner as well, these things are not being documented, and he's not being held accountable for these things. And so we just see the way that these systems and institutions and procedures and policies don't truly benefit the people who need it the most. Don't benefit the people who are the most vulnerable, the people who are the most susceptible to the negative aspects of whether it's home owning or living in a home or being a tenant. The people who are the most vulnerable tenants and the most susceptible as tenants to be in unhabitable living circumstances, these systems and procedures and policies don't benefit them. Okay, let's continue reading. Not long after taking over the trailer park, Buick management fired Lenny and Susie. After reading his termination letter, Lenny began removing his things from the office in which he had worked for the past 12 years. He gathered his tools and unscrewed his deer antlers from the wall. The door swung open and a man with sunglasses asked, quote, Can I get an extension? End quote. Lenny paused. Quote, I don't know. I'm out of here. End quote, he finally said. What in the past had become routine was now far from certain. A worried look worked over the man's face. He left and told the first person he saw. As news spread, a tremor of fear whipped through the park. Would the new management company honor the deal struck over a handshake? Would rents go up? Would evictions? Some tenants hated Lenny and Office Susie, but at least they were known. Quote, ain't gonna get no leeway with this setup, end quote, Dawn said. Quote, people that were working at the office worked with people because we're just making poverty over there, end quote. When the news reached Dawn's neighbor, Tam, a 7 months pregnant drug addict, she walked into the office and gave Lenny a long hug. On their last day, Office Susie erased her greeting from the voicemail system, and Lenny laid his heavy ring of keys on the desk. Big management replaced Lenny with a recent graduate of the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire. At 23, young enough to be Lenny's son, the replacement was clueless and patronizing, but he stuck it out. The new maintenance man quit after a week, saying, quote, I mean, 99% of the houses in here are just too far gone. I've been working on mobile houses for 7 years, and I've never worked in a park like this, end quote. With Lenny and Susie gone, Tobin had to take care of some matters himself. It didn't bother him. He had always been a hands-on landlord. In his 12 years at College Mobile Home Park, Tobin had learned to pull profit out of 131 dilapidated trailers. Most impressive was his ability to transform an utterly trashed trailer into a rent-generating machine in a matter of days, and for next to nothing. After evicting a tenant named Theo and his girlfriend from E24, Tobin needed to have the trailer cleaned out. Theo was known in the park as a, quote, never sweat, end quote, a lazy slob who didn't work. His trailer was a disaster. Tobin hired Mrs. Mites to clean it out. Unlike some of the other older residents who seemed to be waiting to die, swallowing prescription pills and nodding off in front of the television, Mrs. Mites still had plenty of fight left. She and her adult daughter, Meredith, would get into foul-mouthed shouting matches first thing in the morning. While driving to or from their jobs, trailer park residents would sometimes spot Mrs. Mites several miles away from home, pushing a shopping cart brimming over with aluminum cans. She was strong and knew how to work. Mrs. Mites was grateful for the extra money, even if it was E24. She could smell the trailer standing 10 feet away. Inside, the meth was pathological. There were ashtrays and cigarettes on the floor. The sink was piled high with food-encrusted dishes. Black grime had taken over the toilet. Trash was everywhere. Several spots in the carpet were damp with cat piss, and honey-colored strips of fly tape dangled from the ceiling. Theo and his girlfriend had moved in a hurry, leaving behind piles of stuff. Theo and his girlfriend had moved in a hurry, leaving behind piles of stuff. A pair of roller skates, a motorcycle helmet, a couch, a full toolbox, a toy helicopter, a driver's license. Mrs. Mites began hauling everything to the dumpster. After a few loads, she asked Office Susie for a pair of rubber gloves. Rufus the junk collector appeared at the door. Quote, whoa, end quote, he said, looking around. Quote, I hate to say it, but even niggers aren't cleaner than crazy ass. Okay. Let me try that sentence again. I wasn't prepared for the racism. Rufus the junk collector appeared at the door. Quote, whoa, end quote, he said, looking around. Quote, I hate to say it, but even niggers are cleaner than this, end quote. Mrs. Mites let out a loud, ha, end quote, and kept working. I should have said, quote, ha, end quote, and kept working. Fuck Rufus and Mrs. Mites, racist ass motherfuckers. Okay, let's continue reading. Rufus was there for the medal. He had been a full-time junk collector since 1984 and was proud that his life, quote, didn't revolve around a mailbox, end quote, as it did for his neighbors who waited each month for their SSI checks. Tobin had asked Rufus to pull out the microwave, refrigerator, dryer, and other larger items. He was yanking on the dishwasher when Tobin walked in. Wearing pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt, Tobin narrowed his eyes. He was unfazed, having seen this kind of mess before. Quote, okay, Rufus, end quote, Tobin said. Quote, let's get this shit out of here and see where we stand, end quote. It took Rufus 2 hours to load everything into the bed of his old blue Chevy. Tobin didn't pay him anything, but he collected almost $60 from the scrapyard. It took Mrs. Mites 5 straight hours. Tobin paid her $20. Once the trailer was cleared out, Tobin placed an advertisement in the paper. Soon, couples were coming to look, and Tobin offered them the handyman special. He apologized for the condition of the trailer. It still smelled of cat urine and smoke. Some windows were broken, and the black grime on the toilet was still there. But as consolation, he threw in a couple months' free rent. A few weeks after Theo left, Tobin had a new pair of tenants in E24. The couple began to use the money they were saving on rent to fix up their new home. 2 months later, they began paying Tobin $500 a month in lot rent. Office Susie thought Tobin had shortchanged Mrs. Mites, but she didn't say anything. She called Tobin's other workers, who cut the grass or picked up trash for beer money, quote, regular trailer park tramps, end quote. Tobin fired the tramps after Alderman Witowski stipulated he hire outside maintenance help, but kept some working out of boredom or the hope that Tobin would still pay them something. But some kept on working out of boredom or the hope that Tobin would pay them something. Troy, a bony, out-of-work motorcycle mechanic, was one of them. He had even helped mop up the sewage spill that had made the news. For that, he got nothing but an earful from his common-law wife, Samantha. Quote, "What are we supposed to do?" end quote, Samantha had yelled in her uniform from George Webb, a Wisconsin-based chain restaurant that served breakfast all day long. They were behind in rent and were hoping that Tobin would credit them something for Troy's 8 hours of puke work, even if Tobin had not hired him for the job. Quote, "You cleaned up shit. Human shit," end quote. Quote, "I'll tell you," Troy said. Quote, "I've cleaned up horse shit when I was shoveling stables. I've cleaned up chicken shit, but I ain't never had to clean up human shit. It was terrible," end quote. Quote, "I know, 'cause you smell bad. I'm a bitch," end quote, she continued. Quote, "I'm a bitch, and Troy, you don't got no bitch in you," end quote. Troy dropped his head in quiet agreement, taking a sip of a milkshake that Samantha had brought home from work. Quote, "Tobin wants to whine and cry all the time," end quote, he said. Quote, "The guy's filthy rich and he still wants money. He makes more than $1 million on this park," end quote. He gestured toward the line of trailers. Quote, "Add it up," end quote. Alderman Witowski had quoted a similar number, estimating that Tobin's trailer park netted more than $900,000 a year. Both Troy and Witowski arrived at that figure by multiplying Tobin's 131 trailers by the average monthly rent, $550. It was a sloppy calculation that assumed Tobin didn't have any expenses or vacancies, and that his tenants always paid their rent in full. Tobin didn't have a mortgage. He had bought the trailer park for $2.1 million in 1995 and paid it off 9 years later. But he did have to pay property taxes, water bills, regular maintenance costs, Lenny's and Office Susie's annual salaries and rent deductions, advertising fees, and eviction costs. After accounting for these expenses, vacancies, and missing payments, Tobin took home roughly $447,000 each year, half of what the alderman had reported. Still, Tobin belonged to the top 1% of income earners. Most of his tenants belonged to the bottom 10%. Troy finished the milkshake. Quote, "Did that hit the spot, baby?" Oh, damn, my fault. Troy finished the milkshake. Quote, "Did that hit the spot, baby?" End quote, Samantha asked, rubbing his shoulder. That's the end of that chapter. I was thinking that he was saying it did hit the spot, but she was asking him, did it hit the spot? That's my fault. Okay. That brings us to the end of chapter 13 and to the beginning of chapter 14, which is entitled High Tolerance. And I think we're about halfway through this book right now. We are on page 177, and the book is 313 pages long. So yeah, halfway through, a little bit more than halfway through. And what stands out to me the most in the passage we just read is that second to last paragraph when it says, Tobin took home roughly $447,000 each year, half of what the alderman had reported. Still, Tobin belonged to the top 1% of income earners. Most of his tenants belonged to the bottom 10%. And that tells you everything you need to know about the disconnect between why these That tells you everything you need to know about the disconnect that exists between Tobin as the landlord and the landowner and the tenants that live in this trailer park. And when you think about the fact that he is in the top 1%, and then you think about how the lack of care, the lack of empathy, the lack of understanding that he has for the tenants that are in these trailer park, that is in this trailer park. And I say that because we've seen how he rushed to get somebody else in there without making sure that it was we've seen how he rushed to get somebody in E24 before he made sure that E24 was habitable and was livable, and before he made sure that grime and the smell was out. He did that because he was in a hurried desire to make more money. And it's easy to understand why people in the bottom 10% of income are making hurried decisions to make more money. And it's a lot harder to understand why somebody in the top 1% has that same mind state without it just being greed, without it being exploitative, and we've seen how each person who is a landlord in all of these different situations, all of these different circumstances throughout this book, the greed that they have, we've seen the exploitative nature that they have with their tenants. And this is not something that is an outlier. This is something that happens regularly all over this country. And that's one of the things that I think that is important always to emphasize when we're reading these stories or reading these books where somebody's taking an isolated look at something, to remember that these things happen in so many different places in so many different ways. And just because we're looking at a unique perspective, it doesn't mean that this unique perspective is one that is not repeated regularly all over this country. Oh, okay. So let's end this episode. We will be back tomorrow with another episode of Rockford Reading Daily as we continue reading Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Holla at you tomorrow. Oh, and I guess I should say this too. And we got a glimpse of the racism that exists within within classism. These white people within this trailer park are poor white people that are on SSI. They're essentially not essentially, but these are white people who themselves may feel as if they don't have the privilege that comes with being white. And we can see how even still within there, even though they understand that they're discriminated against because of how much money they make or because of where they live at, they still are uh, mimicking that same type of discrimination and prejudicial attitude towards black people, as we've seen in the exchange between Mrs. Mites and the racist guy who came to help with the maintenance stuff in E24. All right, holla at you tomorrow.